In the darkest hours of World War II, when Britain stood alone against the overwhelming might of Nazi Germany, the burden fell on one man above all others to rally the beleaguered country. His name was Winston Churchill, and this was his finest hour. I'm Peter Graves, and this is Biography. If ever a man was matched to a moment, then such a man was Winston Churchill in 1940 and 41. All around, Europe had been overrun by the Nazi blitzkrieg, and only England still resisted, bombarded night after night in fierce aerial attacks. In this grim time, Winston Churchill came into his own as a leader, his emotional speeches igniting his country. He would later say, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour." What follows is a portrait of Churchill during the pivotal months when Britain fought for survival. An intimate profile is told through the friends and co-workers and personal staff that stood with him. Join us now for Churchill, To Conquer or to Die.
On the 10th of May 1940, as German forces drove into France, Belgium and Holland, Churchill became Prime Minister. He was 65.
I speak to you for the first time as Prime Minister in a solemn hour for the life of our country, of our allies, and above all, of the cause of freedom. A tremendous battle is raging in France and Flanders. The Germans, by a remarkable combination of air bombing and heavily armored tanks.
Within 2 weeks of Churchill becoming Prime Minister, the German army had smashed through the Allied defences in France. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were in full retreat before the German blitzkrieg. For Churchill, there could be no question of surrender.
Arm yourselves and be ye men of valour, and be in readiness for the conflict, for it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation and our altars.
It was as if the man had been waiting for this moment all his life, and it was as if we had been waiting all our lives for this man to come forward.
When you're up against the threat of defeat, as we certainly were, and when we were standing alone, then you have to have somebody like Churchill who isn't rational, who isn't weighing up the chances soberly, but who is giving rein to his romantic fantasy life in his speeches, and who rallies everybody around so that people become heroes and work twice as hard.
Now at last the gloves are off. There will be no more hesitation on our part. We must return 10 blows for every one we get. Now the Allied war machine is rolling on with a momentum that cannot be...
When Mr. Churchill took over in May 1940, the whole place exploded. It was as if a current of high voltage electricity was let loose, not only in Number 10 itself, but throughout the fusty corridors of Whitehall. And we heard that civil servants were seen, elderly civil servants were seen running along the corridors.
The even tenor of our life was entirely upset by this tornado which appeared on the horizon. But it suddenly became frightfully exciting because one realized that the country was at war.
He introduced stickers saying, "Action this day," or when requesting information from heads of departments or ministries, he would put "report to me" on one side of a page. And those who worked personally for him, night duty meant just that. I never remember being released to get to bed before 1 a.m., and it was more often 2 to 3 a.m.
In 6 months of Churchill, there was 5 years of change. It was, again, quite a remarkable thing. He cut through all the red tape. He put Beaverbrook into aircraft production, for example, and within a very short time, Beaverbrook had doubled the number of aircraft that were being produced, simply by cutting through the red tape. And Churchill was a real red tape cutter.
Churchill now had to guide Britain through its greatest military disaster. At the end of May 1940, the British and French armies were trapped at Dunkirk.
We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might, and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs.
More than 300,000 British and French troops were evacuated from Dunkirk. It was a miraculous escape, but Churchill knew that wars were not won by evacuations.
Sometimes he'd put his head in his hands and hardly eat, and then he'd suddenly say, "This is one of the hardest times." I mean, he reflected everything that was going on, and there were some very bad times, some worse times than most of the normal people knew about.
We are told that Herr Hitler had a plan for invading the British Isles. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
I mean, the whole situation was so desperate and so emotional. And I think there could have been a general wave of panic and despair, but he was absolutely like a rock. I mean, there's no question of defeat, and his great speeches in the House, you know, we will fight on the beaches, we will never surrender.
We shall defend our island, and with the British Empire around us, we shall fight on, unconquerable, until the curse of Hitler is lifted from the brows of men.
I can tell you that every man there, they rose in spirits. You could almost measure it. We would have gone down to the beaches then and beaten the Nazis up with broom handles. Such was the magic effect of Churchill.
In France, the situation was critical. With the French army on the verge of collapse, a desperate appeal was made to Churchill by the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud.
At 7:30 in the morning, I telephoned Churchill. I woke him up. I told him, "We have lost the battle. We are beaten." But Churchill seemed so astonished that I had to repeat, "We are beaten, we have lost the battle." "Impossible," he said.
Churchill flew immediately to France. He knew that if France surrendered, Britain would stand alone. His destination was a crisis meeting of the French War Cabinet. He now made a dramatic personal attempt to keep France in the war. When Churchill came here, the German army was already poised to enter Paris. The French government had retreated to this small chateau in the center of France. Churchill needed to know that France would fight on, and above all would fight for Paris. But General Weygand, the commander-in-chief of the French forces, had already ordered Paris to be abandoned, seeking to stiffen French resolve, and knowing that several of the ministers around this table wanted France to fight on, Churchill asked, "Where are the French reserves?" To which Weygand answered, "There are no reserves." To fight on, Reynaud needed more British planes, but Churchill knew that they would be needed to defend Britain if France were to fall. Churchill had told the French that even if France capitulated, Britain would fight on until victory was secured. As he left, he knew that those in charge of the destiny of France had lost the will to fight.
France was something very important for him. So to speak, he could be considered as a lover of France. And France betrayed him as a girl who leaves a man, drops him abruptly, without explanation. And at the moment, it was absolutely unexpected.
I have this picture of him sort of his head buried in his hands of poor France. Yeah.
On the 14th of June 1940, German forces entered Paris. A week later, France sought an armistice with Germany.
The Battle of France is over. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit upland. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Churchill expected a German assault to come at any time. He had spent 10 years in vain urging greater rearmament. Now he awaited the invasion of a weak and ill-defended Britain.
We had no guns, no rifles. We had one Lee Enfield rifle, which we were allowed to go onto the range and fire only 2 bullets because there wasn't enough. And that was in the possession of the sergeant of the squad. And so during the day we trained with broom handles. I mean, if Hitler had known, he should have come straight away, you know.
I remember once when there was a talk of an invasion and all the barriers were going up around the coast and talk of children being sent overseas. And remember him one night at the dinner table saying to all of us, "You can each take a dead German with you." And I said, "But Papa, I don't know how to shoot a gun. I haven't got a gun." He looked at me very severely and said, "You can go into the kitchen and get a carving knife."
To those in Britain who now talked of surrender, Churchill said, "Let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood." He forbade all peace dealings with the Nazis. He also ordered the French warships in North Africa to surrender to the British or to sail to neutral ports. He could not risk the Germans using the French Navy against Britain. His ultimatum was refused. On the 3rd of July 1940, the Royal Navy opened fire on the warships of its ally. Over 1,200 French sailors were killed by British guns.
Nous avons été très fâchés, très mécontents, et des Anglais, de Churchill en particulier. Si Churchill avait pu venir à ce moment-là à Mademoiselle-Kébir, je ne sais pas si nous aurions pu lui faire. Ça, c'était vraiment une haine terrible, que nous avons conservée très longtemps d'ailleurs.
This ruthless decision to sink the French warships was the hardest Churchill had to take during the whole war.
Churchill realized that many countries, notably the United States, believed that Britain could scarcely carry on alone after the collapse of France. And he was determined to show them that the opposite was the case. 6 months later, he told President Roosevelt's emissary that Oran was the turning point in our fortunes. It showed the world that we were sincere and determined in our intention to carry on the war.
We cannot tell when they will try to come. We cannot be sure that in fact they will try at all. But no one should blind himself to the fact that a heavy, full-scale invasion of this island is being prepared with all the usual German thoroughness and method, and that it may be launched at any time now upon England, upon Scotland, or upon Ireland, or upon all three. If this invasion is going to be tried at all, it does not seem that it can be long delayed.
The first stage of Hitler's plan to invade Britain was to win air supremacy so that his army could cross the Channel unchallenged. During August, hundreds of German aircraft launched their deadly raids daily against Britain's ports and airfields. The Battle of Britain had begun. Britain's fate now lay in the hands of a few hundred pilots. Many had learnt to fly for fun before the war. Now they were taking on the full might of the German Air Force.
It's the time, he said, there is a time to live and there is a time to die. He was referring to the pilots because Winston related to young people, and I think in war particularly he was terribly conscious that he was the person that was instigating them going to their death, possibly. And I think this bothered him enormously.
By September, over half of Britain's pilots had been shot down, and many killed. On one occasion from the operations room, Churchill could see that every squadron was in the air. There were no reserves, but he refused to be downhearted.
Never despair, but certainly gloom when the news was very bad. The loss of lives, awful. And my father, of course, understood what each loss meant in relation to our actual strength.
All our hearts go out to the fighter pilots, whose brilliant actions we see with our own eyes day after day. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
Against the odds, Hitler lost the battle against Britain's airfields. Now he sent his bombers over Britain's cities. When raids took place over London, Churchill stayed in the capital, often watching from the roof of one of the government buildings in Whitehall.
I remember on one occasion, it was very lively around St. James's Park and the environs, heavy bombing. And he said, "Are you frightened, Miss Holmes? Are you sure you're not frightened?" I said, "No, I'm not frightened." It was impossible to be frightened in his presence.
As more and more German bombs fell on London, Churchill and his closest advisors were forced to move underground. Here they worked in cramped conditions, often hearing the thud, thud, thud of bombs falling on London above. Churchill had a study here, This was his bed. To this room, British intelligence brought him news of Germany's most secret invasion plans. Behind this curtain was a map on which were marked the most vulnerable points of Britain's sea defences. Churchill alone knew the extent of the danger. Yet the British public looked to him for words of reassurance that Britain would not go under.
The British nation is stirred and moved, and it never has been at any time in its long, eventful, famous history. And it is no hackneyed trope of speech to say that they mean to conquer or to die. What a triumph the life of these battered cities is over the worst that fire and bomb can do.
He scarcely stopped in his journey through cheering men and women. It's another way of saying, are we down...
By the end of December 1940, the city of London, the East End and the London docks had been severely damaged. In 5 months, more than 22,000 civilians had been killed.
In the outer suburbs somewhere, in a rather poor region of London there, little shops and things, there was a long queue of people outside a shop. So he instantly told the driver to stop, and told his detective to go and see what the queue was about. This was important because queues of anything in conditions like that are a danger signal. Serious shortages may herald discontent, and he just always wanted to be sure on that. So the detective went off to find out what it was, and he came back, and Churchill said, well, what are they queuing for? Birdseed, sir. And Winston, he did weep, I mean, the great tears. The thought of these wretched people queuing in the dusk of the raids just beginning for their canaries. I think it was part of his character, his quality, that he wasn't ashamed to be emotional.
The people of Britain, they wouldn't have shown that heroism and stamina if they'd thought they got a weak leadership that was waiting to sell them down the river. And of course, Churchill epitomized that fighting spirit. You know, you had the feeling, if you were in those London blitzers, that as you walked among the bomb-racked streets, you could just turn the corner and run into Winston Churchill. Because he was in touch. He would go out from his little hidey hole and see for himself. He would share risks, he would share danger. And he completely created the will of the British people to fight, whatever the cost, to the very end. Surrender seemed inconceivable. And you need that, you know, when you're all in the front line, as we all were then.
We ask no favours of the enemy. We seek from them no compunction. On the contrary, if tonight the people of London were asked to cast their votes as to whether a convention should be entered into to stop the bombing of all cities, an overwhelming majority would cry, no, we will mete out to the Germans the measure, and more than the measure, they have meted out to us. We will have no truce or parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.
Throughout these critical times, Churchill was supported by his wife Clementine. She shared his worries and visited the bomb-damaged cities with him.
The marriage of Clementine and Winston Churchill was remarkable, and the tender love between them for a young girl to observe was most interesting and a great example of the wisdom that if you love somebody, lose no opportunity to express it. And this they did verbally, and when apart, nurtured in tender notes. And they had this wonderful, amusing side that he would sign his letters with a pig and she would sign hers with a cat. It was this lovely, lovely relationship. This does not mean to say that they agreed on everything. Far from it.
I don't think I'd quite describe it as contented. I don't think that's quite the word, because they naturally had arguments and so on. I think one of my first impressions was that they were both selfish. But perhaps they had to be. They're absolutely matched. They could talk, and obviously they were very much in love. And they were tremendous companions. You see, she was an educated woman with a very good brain. And she wasn't just beautiful. He liked beautiful women, but they had to have brain as well. And she could match him in conversation and in every way.
I think it was very important to have Clemmy there, who didn't believe in flattery. And, you know, she would, there was a wonderful letter, I know, that she wrote to him at one point during the war, saying that he was being very rude and objectionable to all his staff, and they were all very unhappy, and that he should know about it and shape up.
Churchill's rough, sarcastic behaviour grew worse as Hitler's bombing intensified, and the burdens on him grew almost to breaking point. These were hard times, and the stress was beginning to tell.
Well, he could get into a rage. He could. Once I knew him to throw the telephone on the floor because somebody on the telephone had annoyed him, and it broke. And he said, when he'd recovered a bit, he said, "You won't tell them how it happened, will you?"
I'd been warned that he would not be pleased to see a new face coming to serve him. And this evening, it was at in the study at the annex. I went in for dictation, and he gave me a sharp look as I went in, said nothing. And when I started typing, I found that somebody had left the typewriter at single spacing, whereas, of course, we all knew it had to be done in double spacing at all times. I didn't know what to do, so I just carried on. Presently he came behind to see how I was getting on, and he just exploded like a rocket. And he returned to his ministers at the other end of the study, and I heard him saying, "The mug, idiot, bloody fool." So then he sent me out and sent for somebody who, he said, could do his work right the first time.
It was a sin to ask him to repeat anything because it upset his train of thought, and he objected to this very much. And I did a lot of work when I was on trips abroad with him straight onto the typewriter. And I learnt from experience that if you didn't hear a word, and sometimes he wasn't all that clear, you couldn't say, "Prime Minister, I didn't hear," but you just leave, you hoped, a sufficient blank to put in a missing word when it was finished. And then he would not very happily tell you which words you fix, and you could just probably squeeze it in the right space.
In public, Churchill spoke of victory, but he knew that Britain could win only if America entered the war. Roosevelt had assured America it would remain neutral. Churchill had to persuade him at least to send the maximum military help.
It must be remembered, which the British often forget, that just before the war broke out, Mr. Roosevelt was for a long time considered an isolationist. He was not a supporter. He was not pro-Nazi, but he was all for the United States keeping well out of any European problem, regardless what it was. And that is forgotten. And he was slowly won over and brought over, I think, for the most part, by Churchill.
Churchill decided to appeal directly to the American people.
Every month that passes adds to the length and to the perils of the journey that will have to be made. United we stand, divided we fall.
When Churchill made speeches that were obviously designed to draw America into the war, I just wished he'd shut up and drop into the deep blue sea. At the time, I felt it was not helpful to what was going on in the world, and I felt that there was only trouble ahead for the U.S. and the rest of the world. There were many Americans who were very distrustful of British imperialism, particularly as represented by Winston Churchill. He was an old-fashioned man who, some of us thought, was not a real Democrat with a little d at heart. British had maintained their colonies for years, and obviously Winston Churchill was loath to give them up.
The British colonies were to prove a vital bargaining point. In return for providing America with naval and air bases in the British West Indies, Churchill persuaded Roosevelt to give Britain 50 old destroyers.
Churchill knew that he needed the destroyers for our survival. The other was, I think he was quite keen to involve the Americans as far as possible. And anything which sort of brought the Americans nearer to the war, which this did, was advantageous.
Why the thumbs up? Because the American...
Under Lend-Lease, arms and supplies would now come from America on a pay-later basis. This was a generous gesture by Roosevelt. Churchill called it the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. Britain was still bracing itself for a full-scale German invasion across the Channel when in June 1941 Hitler attacked Russia. From secret intelligence sources, Churchill had been able to warn Stalin of Hitler's impending attack.
Сталин был вообще очень недоверчивым человеком. Я думаю, что кроме себя он никому полностью никогда не доверял. И поэтому предупреждения, которые шли с Британских островов, он отнесся к ним как к типичной дипломатической попытке толкнуть Советский Союз на борьбу с Германией.
Churchill was never a real friend of Russia. He understood that Russia is now needed because it is fighting the enemy that is threatening Britain, and I think it was a great relief for Churchill when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and then he understood that now Britain will survive. And this was then, of course, a political gesture when he immediately pronounced his speech next day after the invasion.
Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and to the Russian people.
The communist state that Churchill had wished to strangle at its birth in 1917 was now a crucial ally. But as the German armies swept through Russia, Churchill feared that Hitler's ambitions to dominate the world could now become reality. Of that summer, Churchill wrote, "Normally I wake up buoyant to face the new day. Then I awoke with dread in my heart." He was now possessed with one idea, to bring America into the war. In August 1941, he crossed the Atlantic with his chiefs of staff for his first meeting with Roosevelt.
Churchill was going to come aboard, and he was coming aboard from the Prince of Wales, which had just come in and anchored a little short time before. And Father was standing at the and I was holding his arm to steady him, and he was getting ready the head of the gangplank for the Prime Minister to come aboard. Well, the Prime Minister came aboard and advanced toward my father with his hands out, and it was the most moving experience. It was just like they were old friends who had just come back together, hadn't seen each other for quite a while.
One felt there was the beginning of a tremendously close relationship, and one could tell whenever the Prime Minister referred to President Roosevelt, as he would in messages to London and so forth, that there was this tremendous confidence, relief, and already a sincere friendship.
As a result of Churchill's urgings and the arguments of the British Chiefs of Staff, Roosevelt agreed to send more weapons to Britain and to give aid to Russia on a massive scale. But despite the friendliness, not a single American officer one of Churchill's staff recorded, showed the slightest keenness to be in the war on our side.
All of the crews of both vessels were gathered together on the Prince of Wales. The service was held on the fantail, and the President and the Prime Minister sat together with all of their advisors ranged around them, and the crew were perched all over the rest of the vessel.
The Prime Minister really chose the hymns, and it was really most impressive, and I could see, I was a little way away from him, but he was obviously visibly affected. He was a very kind-hearted, emotional man.
And you could see my father very, very moved. And while I couldn't see whether he was actually crying, I knew that he was very close to it. And I felt that this was probably one of the great moments of history.
After 4 days of talks, here off Newfoundland, Churchill and Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter, pledging to restore sovereignty to all states overrun by the Nazis. Churchill was disappointed, however, that America still had no intention of entering the war. In December 1941, the Japanese struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor.
Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
To Churchill's amazement, Germany now declared war on the United States. America had at last become Britain's ally against Hitler. Churchill had no doubts about how the conflict would end. "I went to bed," he later wrote, "and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful."
Winston was delighted, of course, because this meant that the Americans were in the war. And they wouldn't have come in willingly, you know, for a very long time if this hadn't happened.
Within a week of Pearl Harbor, Churchill left Britain for Washington. Britain and America were now at war with both Germany and Japan. At their talks in the White House, Churchill and Roosevelt pledged that war and peace would be made together, and Roosevelt agreed that the defeat of Germany must come before the defeat of Japan. Churchill worked day and night that Christmas on the most important speech of his life. Roosevelt had asked him to speak to Congress, still reluctant to become involved in a war in Europe.
The fact that my American forebears have for so many generations played their part in the life of the United States, and that here I am, an Englishman, welcomed in your midst, makes this experience one of the most moving and thrilling in my life, which is already long and has not been entirely uneventful. By the way, I cannot help for reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own.
I was, of course, deeply impressed not only with the great rolling cadences and the prose, but the substance, and also with the joke which abused Congress so much about how he might have gotten there on his own if his parentage had been turned around the other way. And it was a very, very impressive talk, a talk that left, I think, a lasting impress on me.
I am so glad to be able to place before you members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives, at this moment, when you are entering the war, the proof that with proper weapons and proper organization, we are able to beat the life out of the savage Nazi. Lastly, if you will forgive me for saying it, to me the best tidings of all, the United States, united as never before, has drawn the sword for freedom and cast away the scabbard.
The substance of it was a message of hope, a message of the vital necessity of fighting the war, and for young soldiers who were just in the Army and who were not really all that perhaps convinced that we actually had to fight. It was not only an enormous inspiration, but it was a very welcome lift, not just to the day, but for most of the years of the war.
But the pace and pressure of Churchill's visit to America now began to take its toll.
Late one night, after a long discussion with the President and his staff, Churchill felt the need for fresh air. Struggling to open a window here in the White House, he collapsed. It was a heart attack. "You're not to tell me to rest," he told his doctor. "I won't, I can't. Nobody else can do this job. I must." At the very moment of America's entry into the war, Britain could not be seen to have an invalid prime minister with a damaged heart and an uncertain future. The news of the illness had to be kept secret.
3 days after his heart attack, the 67-year-old Prime Minister went by train to Canada.
When Mr. Churchill went to Canada, what a reception he got on arrival in Ottawa.
It was like having a god come out. One realized why the Romans deified their successful generals and emperors. One of the things I had to do in Ottawa was to take care of all the presents which were sent to him. There were thousands of presents from all over Canada came. Silk handkerchiefs embroidered with the flaxen hair of young women. Cigars by the thousand, and the instructions there, he wasn't allowed to smoke them for security reasons, but our instructions were to destroy them by fire, which we did.
He went to Parliament House to make the second of those great speeches he delivered from overseas.
We have been concerting the united pacts and resolves of more than 30 states and nations to fight on in unity together, without any thought except the total and final extirpation of the Hitler tyranny, of the Japanese frenzy, and the Mussolini flop.
Presently, he referred to those black days in 1940, just before the fall of France, and the talks he had with the French cabinet at that time.
When I warned them that Britain would fight on alone, whatever they did, their generals told their prime minister and his divided cabinet, in 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. Some chicken. Some neck.
From Canada, Churchill went back to Washington. He was exhausted. When he reached the White House, the change in him was noticed immediately.
He was not in very good shape. As a matter of fact, I was quite surprised at his wan expression, because he was quite a ruddy, round-faced individual, and he looked so terribly drawn that it was quite noticeable. And also, he didn't seem to have the bounce.
Despite his success in America, in Britain, Churchill's leadership was being questioned as disaster followed disaster. In the Atlantic, Britain was losing over half its convoys to German U-boats.
I don't think people ever really appreciated how desperately close run thing that was. That the German wolf pack, the submarines out in the Atlantic, really were in very serious danger of cutting our lifelines. It could have been absolutely desperate, and the losses in merchant shipping simply could not have gone on.
In North Africa, the British Army was in retreat. In the Far East, Britain's empire had been overrun by the Japanese. The biggest blow to Churchill had been in February 1942, when Singapore surrendered. 62,000 Indian, British and Australian troops were taken into captivity. At home, people were becoming dispirited and resentful. After 2 years of war, they expected Churchill to bring them the victory he had promised. That summer, a vote of censure was brought against him in the Commons. His very position as Prime Minister was challenged.
This was a very, very difficult period, and I think that it was a period when also we felt that Winston was being criticized. And I remember going to the House of Commons to listen, my mother-in-law, to listen to some of his speeches and being really quite worried. I don't think any of us thought that his reign as Prime Minister was as secure as when you read history it seemed to be.
It's the only time in the whole war I saw him looking really anxious. Because the only thing he feared in the world, you know, was Parliament. He was frightened of Parliament. He was a good Democrat. And he said, this is going to be a critical debate, you know.
Churchill won by a large majority, but an opinion poll showed half the country dissatisfied with the conduct of the war.
The end may be far off. We cannot tell. That depends upon the enemy. How long he will resist, we cannot tell. How long that wicked man will torture and afflict the nations, how often or in what directions he will set his murder machine in motion, we cannot tell.
The war situation worsened with every day. German forces were now within a few miles of Moscow. Russia was bearing the brunt of Hitler's aggression and suffering horrendous losses. Churchill and Clementine urged public support for Russia.
The people of Russia have set up a new standard of courage and of endurance in the terrible sufferings through which they are going. We must pray to God that we shall not be subjected to the same trials which they are undergoing. But if we are, I think that we shall have a very great example to follow.
In North Africa, the British army had been thrown back by Rommel to Alamein. Egypt and Suez were now threatened. A young British officer who was on leave in London asked to see Churchill to tell him that the Desert Army had lost confidence in its commanders.
Suddenly a telephone call comes through, Downing Street on the line, and the senior official I was talking to was rather chuffed, thought it was for him. Could Julian Emery come round to number 10 at once? So I went round, and there was Churchill at the cabinet table with Sir Alan Brooke, the Chief of the General Staff, sitting beside him, otherwise nobody. I think it was Private Secretary. And he asked me about the situation, and I explained that I thought the army was demoralized, and Sir Alan Brooke looked pretty cross that a junior officer, who was only a captain, could express that sort of opinion. And he tried to intervene, but Churchill shut him up and said, go on. And so I explained, and Churchill then said, is there anything we can do? And so I said, well, you can't get the tanks there any quicker, but if you were to go out yourself, show yourself to the army, visit the regiment, make a speech or two, it might make all the difference.
The Premier paid a visit to an advanced landing ground where he met
In August 1942, after nearly 3 years of war, Churchill needed a victory in the field. He flew to North Africa to visit the British Eighth Army.
He arrived in a curious hat, rather like a tortoise on his head, And I imagine that he'd asked for this hat as a memory of his own time in India, because he was very sensitive about his skin. He sunburnt very easily, so this enormous topi, anyway, he appeared and shuffled across the sand. We were lined up to be introduced to him. And then after we'd shaken hands with this small man, much great surprise that he, because one held him in such respect, veneration, that he should be so tiny, although rather paunchy, was a great surprise. He loved being the man on the spot, and he loved the smell of powder. He liked taking part in these things. He would visit the forward troops, and if there were any guns about that he could possibly get his hands on, so to speak, he would like to have fired them. I think he'd been a soldier in his day, and he now was an old war horse sniffing powder, I think.
Churchill found the British troops in bad shape. This splendid army, he wrote to Clementine, is baffled and bewildered by its defeats. There seem to be no plans for an offensive, no attacking zeal. Churchill realized that to the army commanders, Rommel seemed invincible.
I remember him in his bedroom in Cairo with his great dressing gown on with dragons all over it, and his little black velvet slippers, stamping up and down the room saying, Rommel, Rommel, what else matters but beating Rommel? In other words, his mind was entirely fixed on how to win a battle in the Western Desert and to drive the Germans away.
The British commander was General Auchinleck, the Auk. Senior officers told Churchill that Auchinleck should be replaced. He probed Auchinleck's plans to take the offensive.
He said to the Auk, well, General, what are you going to do about it? Or words to that effect. And the Auk was very inarticulate and left the impression that he wasn't quite clear what he was going to do about it. And I remember Hugh Mannering and I, not having been called on, walked away through the sand, wondering who would replace the Auk. I remember we said, who will we get now?
Auchinleck's successor as commander of the Eighth Army was to be General Montgomery. Churchill told Clementine, if he is disagreeable to those about him, he is also disagreeable to the enemy. Churchill then flew eastward to Moscow for his first ever meeting with Stalin.
Nobody expected that Churchill would come out from the belly of the plane, not at the door usually somewhere. So we saw first his legs, and then we saw the upper part of his body, and then finally came his head.
Churchill had only bad news for the Russians. It was, he said, like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole. Churchill had come to Moscow to tell Stalin the brutal truth. Britain and the United States simply did not have the resources to launch a successful invasion of Western Europe in 1942. With the German army less than 100 miles from Moscow and preparing to launch a massive new offensive in the south, the Russians had their backs to the wall. Churchill feared most a Soviet capitulation. When the two leaders met for the first time in the Kremlin, here in Stalin's study, Churchill knew that what he had to say could seriously threaten the fragile alliance. Stalin demanded what he thought Russia had been promised, an Anglo-American invasion of Europe in 1942. Churchill explained that the Western Allies did not yet have the resources for such a massive undertaking.
Of course, it was a great discouragement for Stalin. So he said that he cannot accept this decision. And then he said, you British are afraid of fighting. The Germans are not supermen. You cannot win a war if you don't fight.
Stalin was his usual gruff, ungrateful, rude self, and was complaining about no second front, and never once showed any appreciation for all the equipment which England was shipping out there, or even said, I'm sorry you've lost so many ships on the North Atlantic run to Moscow, or to Russia.
He was making the most outrageous remarks, such as, if you fought the Germans a bit more, you wouldn't be so frightened of them. Well, you can imagine saying that to Churchill.
And so when Winston came back, he was in a filthy mood because he obviously didn't care for him anyway, never had done. And he said to me, take a telegram to Mr. Attlee. Mr. Attlee was the Deputy Prime Minister. And he started saying in this telegram exactly what he thought of Stalin, this rude, ungrateful man, etc., etc. And Clark Carr, the ambassador, said, Prime Minister, I must remind you that this room will be bugged like all the rooms in Moscow. I think he thought, well, Winston would quieten down his criticism a bit, but it had the exact opposite effect. Knowing Winston, then he really said exactly what he thought of Stalin and all I've mentioned before about him being ungrateful and rude, and said, if this continues, we shall return to England. I won't stay. Anyhow, next day, Winston had another meeting arranged with Stalin, and the whole atmosphere had changed. So he'd obviously had a transcript of his very outspoken message to Mr. Attlee, and obviously didn't want the British Prime Minister to leave it after being there a day or day and a half. So it changed the whole atmosphere of the conference.
Despite his disappointment, Stalin accepted Churchill's reasons as valid.
I think that Stalin, you see, he was a very pragmatic person. He couldn't force the British and the Americans to change their mind and to start the invasion. He couldn't do that. But on the other hand, he understood how important is the alliance.
The visit ended with a banquet. Toasts were drunk to the defeat of Hitler. Britain's substantial military aid to Russia would go on. The alliance had held. On his way home, Churchill returned to the desert. There he greeted Montgomery, the new commander of the Eighth Army.
I think that he sensed that the arrival of Montgomery had made a significant difference to the morale of the troops. And as he went about, he himself obviously got cheered and that sort of thing, natural enough. I think Churchill went away then very much aware that the situation was in safe hands.
I want to impress on everyone that the bad times are over. They are finished. Our mandate from the Prime Minister is to destroy the Axis forces in North Africa. It can be done, and it will be done.
Montgomery had to wait for reinforcements and for intelligence reports to confirm that the Germans were running out of vital fuel. Churchill fretted at any delay on the part of his commanders.
Monty, like all generals, annoyed him at various times because they didn't always do what he wanted them to do at the time he wanted them to do it, and Monty wouldn't be hurried and he wouldn't be pushed about.
On October the 23rd, 1942, launching the heaviest artillery barrage of the war, Montgomery struck at Alamein. After 12 days of battle, the Allied breakthrough came. Rommel's once invincible army was in full retreat. Hitler had ordered victory or death. Now 10,000 Germans and Italians were dead on the battlefield. A further 30,000 had surrendered. Here at last was the victory for which Churchill and Britain had waited so long.
We had victory, a remarkable and definite victory. A bright gleam has caught the helmets of our soldiers and warmed and cheered all our hearts. Ah, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
On Churchill's instructions, the church bells, which had been silent since the beginning of the war, were rung throughout Britain. Tonight, he told his staff, there is sugar on the cake.
The Battle of Alamein takes its place with the most famous victories in British history. Up till Alamein, we survived. After Alamein, we conquered.
Montgomery's victory at Alamein was one of the first indications that the tide of war might finally be turning. But, as we'll see in our next episode, Churchill had to lead Britain through many more bloody months of battle before the Allies could contemplate the great invasion, the invasion that would liberate Europe. I'm Peter Graves for A&E. Until next time on Biography.